Hi, I'm Tom Burke, the Associate Dean for Public Health Practice here at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And welcome to Public Health on the Inside, your inside look into the world of public health. Public health practice plays an important role in our everyday lives, particularly as our society is faced with tragedy. On April 15th, just a few weeks ago, our nation was shocked when 2 bombs exploded at the finish line of the Boston Marathon. As a result of the explosion, 3 people were killed and hundreds more were injured. While on the run, subsequent attacks by the suspects left a police officer dead and the city of Watertown and surrounding communities on lockdown. While survivors of the attacks must recover from their horrible physical injuries, many more across Boston and, frankly, the rest of the nation are now dealing with stress and anxiety that follows this first terrorist attack on our soil since September 11th. Joining me by phone today is Dr. George Everly, an award-winning author and researcher in the field of stress and disaster mental health. He's a colleague here at the school and teaches in public health preparedness and a course on trying to help public health officials and communities become more resilient to the impacts of tragedy and disaster. Welcome, George.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let me start right off. Since the bombs went off, the Boston Marathon will always mean something different in people's minds. And although things have been very fluid up there, there must be a real roller coaster of emotions that not just Bostonians, but all of us are feeling. Can you talk a little bit about the impacts, the stress that an event like this might have on the health of our population?
I think when we ask a question like that, we have to understand that there's not one monolithic response that would be appropriate. Events like these are unfolding events. They have a trajectory of their own. Each event is different, but let me share what I think we've seen so far and is fairly prototypic. When something like this, an explosion, an attack occurs, the first response that you typically see is disbelief. It's shock. It's awe. People want to know what's happening. From a public health point of view, again, it's very important that we provide information as soon as possible. This information serves really as an anxiolytic of sorts. It allows people to understand what's happening to them and take appropriate steps to protect themselves and their families. As an investigation unfolds, again, people have this unquenchable thirst for information, and you certainly see that reflected in the various media outlets trying to provide more and more information. At some point, and we saw this fortunately very rapidly, there was apprehension of a suspect, and a beginning of an understanding seemed to emerge in terms of what happened and perhaps why. Initially, with the apprehension of the suspect, you mark the end of one phase and the beginning of another. Often this is relief, jubilation even. Well, justice was served, perhaps, some people are saying. That phase is typically short-lived, however. Once that phase ends, then people start saying, well, I'm glad it sort of turned out okay and justice was served, but why did this have to happen? So often there's a disillusionment that follows, and the disillusionment is second-guessing. What could we have done better? Perhaps even anger that it wasn't prevented. And then there is the process of recovery. And the recovery process is one that can last weeks, months, and for some, literally years.
So all of us were touched by this. Here at Hopkins, I was just about to go into a lecture and I heard about the explosions. And I hope that it was very minor, but as we learned later, it wasn't. But I knew friends who were running the marathon. We all have such a connection to events like this. And I'm just wondering if there must be a certain amount of normal sadness and anxiety and curiosity. But are there ways that you can kind of evaluate those who might want to talk about it or have some kind of help in dealing with the stress?
You know, there is, Tom. Many years ago, I was a clinician, and my specialty was treating something called post-traumatic stress disorder. And aside from the rather standardized treatment protocols, one of the things that we were very interested in is well, what is the defining moment of a trauma? If we can identify that, it's no different than identifying a broken bone via X-ray or a lesion via some internal medicine analysis. Why is it that not everyone is traumatized, and why is it that some people are? And that gives us some insight into perhaps who will have a more difficult trajectory and who will not. And what we decided is that the people that have the hardest time adjusting to events such as these are the people who have had some deeply held belief shattered, upset, destroyed, challenged. Sometimes we call those beliefs worldviews. Mm-hmm. But if I translate it and say, why do child-related events invariably end up being the most distressing? Answer, it's violated a just world belief system that basically good people have good things happen to them. Bad people, hopefully, the belief system would say, get what they deserve. So all of a sudden, children who certainly are good people and deserve a life, when bad things happen to children, it turns our world, the adult world, upside down. Mm. So this just belief system, this fairness belief system, gets shattered. So now you apply it to the Boston Marathon. It gets even worse because here is a celebration, here is a time-honored athletic event, and all of a sudden tragedy. Some would have even used the word I've heard on TV, evil, is now projected onto this event. And that's very upsetting to people. So the people that seem to be walking around just continually shaking their heads saying, I don't get it. I just don't get it. Those are the ones that may not have the spike in terms of acute symptomatology, but those are the ones you worry the most about down the road. The people in the acute spike that we kind of look at and we worry about are the people that are obviously not eating, having sleep disturbance, playing the events over and over again. This is often fueled by watching the TV. And you'll see some people are just addicted to watching the news reports. It's important to get information. It's probably not a good thing to get too much information.
You did a lot of work examining the trauma after 9/11. Can you talk a little bit about what you found in 9/11 and how repeated events might be something to be concerned about?
I did spend a lot of time in New York working first for New York City government, then New Jersey government, and we had never seen anything like this before. One of the things that struck us was ultimately the resilience of the city and the surrounding areas. Never discount the power of human resilience. So Boston, now it's almost a flashback for some people. It is very reasonable to think that there are some people who were New Yorkers in New York at that time who might have been running in that Boston Marathon. What were they thinking? Part of it is it's that flashback. It takes you back to that event and you say, oh my gosh, this can't be happening again. Then you have kind of a bimodal distribution. The people that figure out what's happening, and it again undermines their belief system, in this case of safety, and it makes them vulnerable. Once again, it's like 9/11 all over again. On the other hand, the other group is, this is a flashback, but then they interpret it differently. They say, been there, done that, got the T-shirt. I know what to do. We will come out of this. And you saw a community resilient response. I saw the person on the news broadcast. On her face, it just said Boston Strong. She had just written it in like that in ink or something. And that captures, I think, the spirit of many communities once they understand what has happened. And, what did people do before there were mental health clinicians? A majority of them recovered. So part of our job in the field of disaster mental health is to find out how people naturally recover and help those who are having challenges tap into those same resources.
And we've seen that in Boston. We certainly saw that in New York and other communities that face tragedy. I have a T-shirt after Hurricane Sandy, and New Jersey's strong. So there is that optimism in our populations. And you work on resiliency. We only have a little time left, but I want to ask you about that. As public health officials, as public health professionals, how can we plan and work toward making sure that resiliency is something that we have as a response to these tragedies and people can move forward with healthy and happy lives?
Well, I think the first thing we have to recognize, Tom, is that every community needs a disaster plan, of course, but within that disaster plan must be a disaster mental health plan. And that's where, in my humble opinion, I think we are lacking as a profession. We are not up to speed. We're not where we should be with the disaster mental health plans. Such plans typically have at least two components. One is prevention. What can we do to not just mitigate, but prevent some catastrophic psychological impact? And the second is, how do we mitigate whatever impact there is? So in many ways, resiliency may be defined as the ability to withstand and rebound from adversity. And I think what we've learned is that withstanding, a form of immunity, if you will, and this is based on not only my study of many, many disasters since 1992, but it's also based on some research that I've done with highly resilient people. We have a book coming out, for example, on research we've done with Navy SEALs, and we're looking at the individual resiliency, we're looking at community resiliency. And if you were to ask me, is there one factor that doesn't explain all the variants, but explains a great deal, I would say yes. It's information, proper expectation. And at some point in psychology, the social psychologists talk about something called personal self-efficacy, the belief that regardless of the challenge, I can meet the challenge and be an effective agent of change. What I write about is resilient communities, a group self-efficacy. And we call it a culture of resilience. And what we want to do is we want to go into organizations, we want to build a culture of resilience that is uplifting and supporting, and we know we can do it in organizations. The question is, can we transfer the same principles to the community? And I think that's where we need to go.
George, we've learned a lot. We've learned, frankly, from our mistakes in the past, in Katrina and other disasters, that we didn't pay adequate attention to the public health needs of communities. And yet we've seen the strength of Boston. We've seen resiliency. And we're working in public health toward improving our approaches to that. That's a good message. Do you think that we are blazing a new path in public health so that resiliency will be part of the planning, part of the response, and there is some good to come of this?
Tom, I certainly hope this is going to be the direction of the future. That is not to say we should abandon what we've been doing and doing quite well. The focus in public mental health has typically been starting with the individual and then backing out to the systems. And in the world of resiliency, we've studied resilient people. We understand that resilience can be learned. And what's very, very exciting, and can we teach principles of resilience to people in high-risk situations? Can we teach these principles to children regardless of risk? Can we create resilient organizations that withstand recessions, depressions, that bolster an economy? Can we develop communities that are resilient? And I think the answer is yes. And I think that's the most exciting thing we're going to be doing for the next at least decade or two.
Well, George, I think we really appreciate your insights. Thank you for taking the time today during this busy time for you to address this really critical issue. I'm glad that you leave us with optimism, because public health sometimes really has to address some of the most difficult issues facing our populations, and yet your work in resilience really has a positive message for us. And thank you very much. I want to thank you for being here on Public Health on the Inside, and thanks to our listeners. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Tom.